Hello and welcome to the Hacking State podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Michael Millerman. For those of you who are familiar with my previous work, Michael and I spoke about 2 years ago. At the time, his school was sort of a fledgling intellectual internet project. He was sort of just starting out. And so we had a long and really well-received discussion on Leo Strauss. And ever since then, I've been just dying to bring him back. At the time, we actually did a little bit of a teaser towards the end of it about his expertise in a, previously obscure, now I would say almost notorious Russian political philosopher named Alexander Dugin, who we might get into a little bit today, which Millerman has studied himself and done actually a lot of individual work on, doing translations, as well as spoken to Dugin and continued to do scholarship related to him on his channel and elsewhere. So that is a little bit of background on Michael Millerman. But Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me back.
Thanks for coming on. So, as I said already in the introduction, when we spoke last time, I believe you were pretty early in your journey in starting a philosophy school. So you've created the Millerman School, which I would say, honestly, and again, I've moved on to sort of a different area of my life. I'm sort of more tech focused now. But I come out of a political philosophy background. You come out of a political philosophy background. And so that is sort of our shared interest. And I would say that by my view, the Millerman School is probably the most valuable offer that there is out there, outside of any academic setting, and probably more valuable than many academic settings, if we're being totally honest. So I just wanted to say that I'm really impressed with the school that you've built, with the offerings that you've made, as well as with the cohort of students that you have. I mean, I'm sure some of your students don't wish to be identified, but I think it's pretty clear if you look at, the recommendations that people have made and the kind of people moving through your school, that there's some pretty high level individuals going to you for philosophical advice, for access to the great wisdom of the Western tradition. And so I just wanted to ask you, when you started the school, did you think it was going to work?
Yes, but I didn't have a vision at first of what that meant beyond a pretty minimal criterion, which was this. So I was already out of the University of Toronto. I was in my intermediary phase. I was actually working as a copywriter and doing private tutoring. And so my private tutoring, I was preparing like sometimes, let's say, between 4 and 5 hours for 1 hour of private tutoring, which was an imbalance, it was not sustainable. So the first opportunity to teach at scale that I had was with Justin Murphy, who has otherlife.co, I think is his site, and also Indie Thinkers. That's his two brands. I think he's merging them or something like that. But
yes,
I have to give him credit because it was his invitation to teach a course on Leo Strauss that showed me in principle the scalability of the teaching. So I could still put the same amount of time into prep, more or less, but reach more people at once than I was doing. So the success criterion for the school for me at first was just, can I continue to teach what I want to teach, the way I want to teach it, to groups larger than one person at a time, in order for it to be financially sustainable, in order for me to make enough money to be able to dedicate my time to doing it. And surprisingly, at first, again, when I didn't have grand expectations, I just wanted to meet a bare minimum, that worked. And I was pretty happy and excited about that. So the first course I launched in the school was Leo Strauss's On Tyranny. And it's sort of a happy accident in my view, in retrospect, that I started with that course, because I think it has a kind of renewed significance and a special place. And it's not the obvious first book to teach in an online school of political philosophy, I would say. But the reason is that I had been tutoring On Tyranny to a small group, and I used my basic notes and research that I've been doing for the private tutoring and built it into this video course format that sold. I was very happy. And once I had the proof of concept, I was able to just layer on one course after another. So I have to say that in hindsight, a school that teaches Heidegger, and not only Being in Time, but also works like Contributions to Philosophy of the Event and the Black Notebooks, it's not a self-evident proposition that would be successful enough to become sustainable. So I'm very grateful that it has been. I've had a chance to meet a lot of great students. And especially important for me, I've been able to teach the way that I would want to, even though academia was a closed door for me because of my work on Dugin. So knock on wood, it's been great. As I say, my initial expectations were modest. At some point, I well exceeded the modest expectations that I had. And now I'm at the stage in the development of the school where I can think about what's next, what else is possible, how can it develop, what should it really be aiming at now that it's demonstrated its viability.
Yeah, that's really wonderful to hear. I mean, I saw a tweet that you sent out earlier today where you were, encouraging people to begin putting themselves out on video for very similar reason, which was that, when you first started out, you weren't sure that it was going to be well received. Obviously, everyone is, for the most part, people are not naturally talented at this kind of thing. And so people are worried about how they're going to look or how they're going to behave on camera. And it is an acquired skill that you get used to over time. And you were just putting out a little bit of encouragement there for other individuals who might think that it's not viable for them to grow a business model out of doing these online activities, that it is possible, but you're never going to know until you get started.
Absolutely. I recommend people who are listening to this, if you have something that you want to teach that you think you know, or that you just want to experiment with, potentially leveraging your knowledge or passion on the side, video is a great thing to experiment with, because it's the kind of thing that even if it doesn't go well or doesn't work out, even the failed experiment will teach you a lot along the way. And there's no reason why it has to fail, because you can iterate, you can get better. Being in front of the camera, you get better. The look and feel of the presentation can evolve over time. But it's like anything, the sooner you begin, the sooner you can develop the skills. And something I love about video, again, for me, I feel strongly about it because it's what allowed me to leverage the teaching. It's what allowed me to teach. Like, teaching is a big part of my life. The income that I make from the school is a big part of my income. And I'm able to do it only because I got used to, I still get nervous at times when I go on camera in a live setting or when I teach and tutor, but it doesn't matter. The point is, you can reach people, and people want to learn. They want to be taught. There are a million different reasons why it could be helpful. I'll give you a very quick example of how I see opportunities for people to start to incorporate video. Just because I see it doesn't mean it would work, and doesn't mean that they have to want to do it, but people should be aware of the option. I started jujitsu about a year ago, and there are jujitsu instructors in the gym who they show their moves. They're very good at showing their moves. Okay, fine. There are a lot of online jujitsu instructors, but it doesn't matter. If a person has a jujitsu gym, they have 20, 30 students who go to them regularly. If a student misses a class, but the professor has recorded a move and shared it with his students, he's in the realm of using video to grow his business, even if it's just a value proposition for members of the gym. You miss a class, no problem. We have a video of the basic moves, not a video taught by some random instructor, but by your instructor, the one you're going to see in person in a couple of days. Or somebody I was talking to who has very area specific expertise in, let's say, without naming the field, they're like very expert in their field in some domain. And they were one of the early experts in that field. And I know for a fact this person possesses so much knowledge that would be helpful to anybody looking to get established in the field. Well, okay, there are a couple ways you can communicate that knowledge: one-on-one, in a written form, not at all, or at somehow like at scale, a course that introduces people to the basics of how to get established in that field. So I'm a proponent of video courses because of how they've benefited me and my students. That so many people, I had a great conversation this morning with a student in the school. May they all have the experience that he had, because he said this has been immensely valuable for him. The courses on the Republic, for example, that then he goes into as offline reading groups and has taken what he learned from my course and shares it with the people in his offline group. So it's been like a blessing all around. And I think that there's no reason why that should be unique to me or to the other people currently doing it. So hopefully somebody is, even if one or two people picked up on that tweet or on this conversation and are inspired to start working with video, it's positive, it's positive. I'll even say one other example. Actually, I was thinking today after I wrote that post, and I thought, okay, some people like anonymity, and they may feel like video is not anonymous for the obvious reason that you expose your face. Okay, fine. Number one, a person could do that just for their own benefit. So they learn to be in front of the camera, and you can always pull the audio from it. If you record audio, you don't also have video. But if you record video, you also have audio. But there's also, I saw recently one online figure, he goes by the name Anti-Prophet. Someone sent me his videos. He talks about Dugin in one of his short reels, and he has the best of both worlds, video and anonymity, because he wears a mask in his videos. So even so, you still get the gestures, you still get a sort of connection, and he's able to protect his privacy and maintain his anonymity. So there are a lot of different ways to go about it if you're creative.
So one of the things that I continue to be battling all the time, especially given that I sort of spend most of my time walking in tech circles these days, is the value of philosophy. And it's one of those things that there's always this perennial debate about whether the philosophers should make themselves and their natures known to the broad public, whether philosophy is even an activity for the many in the first place. And if someone is going to proffer a defense of philosophy, a defense of the value of philosophy, or a defense of philosophy as a good in itself, independent of what other externalities it gets you, that is a question that to some extent needs some answering. So I was just wondering, what are the kind of students that you find come into your school, and what are they looking for?
It's a great question. And it's also something that was a big eye opener for me, because when I started the school, I did not have a student in mind. I didn't have an audience in mind. I just knew I want to teach Strauss, so I'm going to teach Strauss and hopefully it attracts somebody. I want to teach Plato, Heidegger, I'm going to do that and hopefully attract somebody. What I found, to my surprise initially, was that most of the people coming to the school, let's say two categories. One of them is the major one, but first I'll do the minor one. So there were some people who were later in life, past their professional career, more or less retired, and looking to reconnect with an old passion for philosophy, or just looking for some deeper meaning in their lives, or now they have the time and the leisure to read what they think are the key books of the tradition, that kind of thing. So there were some people who were retired. There were some people who were in the universities. So their teaching is their profession, and the coursework helped them better understand what it is that they were going to be teaching. For example, okay, they needed sort of a training and better understanding what they themselves were going to be representing as teachers, okay, roughly. But by far, the main category of students were people in their 30s and 40s in the tech sector, software engineers, founders, in some cases, funders, investors. And this was totally surprising to me. I didn't know anything about that world, okay, VC, finance, tech, startups. I just didn't know anything about it coming from academia. I wasn't familiar with it. And nevertheless, person after person was coming to study being and time with me with a background in software engineering or machine learning or somehow the world of tech startups. So that was the first big thing I noticed about the composition of the students who were attracted to the school. And gradually I would interview them and ask them, what attracted you to the school? What are you looking for? Why do you want to study Heidegger? Why do you want to study Plato? Like, how did any of this get on your map in the first place? And there are also some common themes. It's not identical for everybody, but there are common themes. So some people are concerned about the crisis of higher education and the way that spills out into the culture wars generally and into the woke mind virus and all of that. And they're not going to go back to university. They're out of university. And they sort of have some sense. I mean, they're intelligent. They have the time to dedicate to the serious study of something that they consider important. And they have reason to believe, maybe because they are familiar with Peter Thiel and they heard through him Straussian moments, so Strauss must be important and Schmidt must be important. Or in some other way, in some other circle, Heidegger's name came up or something like that. So they're not hearing these people's names for the first time, but they didn't really go deep into them at any other point. Maybe they read, like a chapter on Heidegger and Nietzsche in an existentialism textbook at university 15 years ago, but now they want to know what it's all about. So that's been surprisingly common and extremely encouraging to me and very positive. I would say another thing, maybe one of the reasons for the attraction to Heidegger is because he seems to go beyond, he seems to be able to rigorously explain or present a way of thinking that is not merely technical, but that is still deep, profound, precise, rigorous, penetrating, and all of these kinds of things. So people who are really used to a programmatic way of thinking, they encounter Heidegger and they're blown away by what's there and don't have a clear way of making sense of it, because it's like, it's still thinking, but it's not calculative thinking, you know? It's something rich that they're encountering maybe for the first time or beginning to understand for the first time. So there's been a big interest in Heidegger. And the Plato, I would say, the draw to Plato, many cases like this, okay? People begin to become familiar with the fact that there are gaps in their knowledge of the foundations for some reason. Again, they hear an argument, or I like to use the latest example of Nayib Bukele, the El Salvadorian leader, because his Twitter profile says philosopher king. So if you're like, there's an effective leader, there's a lot of buzz around him, you go to his profile, says philosopher king, you may know that philosopher king is a figure from the Republic, and be like, man, I've had enough of just like loose associations with, you know, cave allegory, philosopher king. I want to now like actually read the book cover to cover, make sense of it, see why he's invoking it. You know what I'm saying? Like there
might be something people there, you know, given that this powerful person has adopted it as their moniker.
Exactly. Or the cave allegory. Everybody somehow, somewhere encounters something about it. Mm-hmm. But a few people also feel that extra additional urge to like get the whole story. You know, it's in the Republic. I've never read the Republic. Everybody roughly knows that Plato is so important for Western civilization, Western philosophy. So some group of people who come to the school, they're like, I felt it was time. I'm ready for the foundations, but I need a guide. And very often, this is another pitch for the video. Very often, they say they found me on YouTube. They say, we found your Plato lecture, your Heidegger lecture, your Strauss lecture, your interview with somebody or somebody else. And you know what? We thought, we want the foundations. We want a guide. We heard you speaking about something and it was like comprehensible and interesting. And then they become members of the Millerman School. So YouTube has been a big part of how people who have the initial motivation connect it with me and my school. That's where they find me. So yeah, tech people interested in foundational thinking. I would also say that there's a sense among some of the people in the startup world that what they are doing is akin to what philosophers do, because philosophers, they shape society and politics by going beyond it in some way. And I think there are founders and funders and startup people who see themselves sort of, equivalently. Like they're bringing something new into the world, they're inventing something new, they're one step ahead, or the technologies that they're dealing with have that kind of role and function. And so they're attracted to the great philosophers who are like the great founders in some way. I mean, even the figure of a founder is a figure in political philosophy. Obviously, we talk about the founder of laws or the founder of political communities, but I think it's like an easy isomorphism, you know?
I think the founder is a sort of generic archetype, right? It's the lawgiver, the one who reestablishes society on a new order. And fundamentally, every ambitious founder is trying to do that in some way.
For sure. I mean, it's a archetype that resonates. And if you think, where does it resonate somehow most archetypally outside of the software world itself in the history of political philosophy? You know, and Heidegger inaugurating another beginning of philosophy, you know, the other figures of the founder that you get from the tradition. So all of those little things line up. And I guess that's my best explanation in brief for why it has been people from the software and tech world. I mean, they also have the ability to pay, which is important. So, you know, a high school student can't necessarily get a course on Heidegger if he doesn't have the money. Although I should say that at several times I had offered steep discounts for students in order to control for that. But still, I mean, no matter what I've done, what I just described is the kind of student who's been most attracted to the school. And lately, the school is really leaning into that to try to find people like that, find people who are trying to understand the crisis of Western civilization, the crisis of the institutions, the meaning of new technologies, the significance of non-technological thinking, which doesn't have to be just ungrounded spiritual woo-woo, but can be very extraordinarily rigorous, like in Heidegger's work, methodologically precise and all the rest of it. So as I say, at the start, I did not have a plan and I did not have an expectation. This is an empirical observation, and it's one that's now part of the, I would say, brand identity of the school. And now it's something I'm deliberately targeting and hoping to find more people like that, because it's been win-win for both of us.
I will ask you a question now that I think is a little bit of a given, but I would like to draw your answer. So one of the interesting puzzles that comes up, I spoke earlier about the need to defend philosophy, especially among my peer group. I get people saying things like, you should just be studying empirical subjects because all of this philosophy stuff is too airy. There's not enough guardrails in terms of keeping the rigor in the thinking. Another common refrain is that I won't say the name of the person who tweeted this, but to paraphrase, is that these books are old and they're sort of falling out of fashion, which by the way is totally in dispute, but this is the supposition that they're falling out of fashion for a reason, which is that we should be reading more contemporary texts, or we should be reading subjects that are refinements of philosophy, right? Like in a way, natural science, political science, economics, these all spring from philosophy. This is something that you talked about at length with Alexander Dugin in your interview with him, about how philosophy is sort of the root of all of the other subjects. And so I wanted to ask you, is Western philosophy dead or alive?
Well, it's not a straightforward question for me. And so here's how I start to think about a question like that. Okay. Dugin has a book, his second Heidegger book. It's called Martin Heidegger, The Possibility of Russian Philosophy. And he says in that book that for liberals, there's no such thing as Russian philosophy. There's just philosophy, because philosophy is a human activity and humans are humans. They're not like segregated into peoples and races in any essential or fundamental sense. What's important is the underlying universal human dimension. So for liberals, Russian philosophy is, it doesn't even make sense to say that. Philosophy is just philosophy. For nationalists, he says, and for conservatives, Russian philosophy is a fact. He says, because it's like they take for granted the existence of a uniquely Russian tradition of thinking, one that is non-Western, since part of what it is to identify as a Russian nationalist or Russian conservative is to identify yourself in opposition to the West. So that's, for them, it's like an established fact. And what really attracted me to Dugin's book, among other things, is that for him, it's a question. He says both the liberals and the nationalists / conservatives, they're failing to see that it's an open question, the possibility of Russian philosophy, which first you'd have to even identify, what does it mean for philosophy to be or not to be Russian? Okay, so similarly with the question of Western philosophy, what does it mean for philosophy to be or not to be Western? So something that I teach a lot, and again, I have to give credit here to Dugin, because it's Dugin's version of Heidegger, Dugin's presentation of Heidegger, that put a certain set of Heidegger's books front and center for me in a way that other presentations of Heidegger didn't. So the one that I have at the top of my book pile right here, Contributions to Philosophy of the Event, which I teach in the school, and which, besides Plato's Republic, is probably my most annotated book at the moment and over the last 10 years. So if you take this as an example, Contributions to Philosophy of the Event, Heidegger says Western philosophy has come to an end, but it's in a transitional moment. It's on a transition towards another beginning of philosophy. And Heidegger himself is the figure who inaugurates both the transition and another inception. And in my view, he's got a very compelling statement of that whole dynamic. So for him, Western philosophy is the quote unquote episode between Plato and Nietzsche. The transition is reflecting on the meaning of that episode, the meaning of that history. And the other beginning of philosophy is seeing what was left out of the first beginning and appropriating it thoughtfully in a new speaking, roughly. That probably wouldn't be totally clear to everybody, but it doesn't matter. So the point there is that he has a well-defined beginning, middle, and end to Western philosophy, as well as a future for philosophy. Left Heideggerians, in my view, took over his model of a beginning, middle, end of philosophy, but they stopped at the end of philosophy. So all of their thinking and working is working within the end and at the end of philosophy. They don't have the figure of another beginning like he has. Whereas Dugin is somebody who incorporated into his own work Heidegger's notion of another beginning of philosophy. And then, sort of adjacent to the dispute over the re-inception of philosophy in Heidegger, you also have people like Strauss, Leo Strauss, as someone who's so important to me, equally important to me as is Heidegger, equally important to the pedagogy of the school and all the rest of it. And Strauss sort of doesn't map onto that fully because he rejects the premise of a beginning and middle and end to philosophy, since he doesn't think that philosophy is primarily historical, whereas for Heidegger, philosophy is primarily historical. So I would say that your question about whether there's the status of Western philosophy today, it can be the kind of question that allows us to think philosophically about the meaning of thinking, the relationship of being and time, of thinking, being and time, and all of these things. Because suddenly it allows us to put Heidegger, left and right interpretations of Heidegger, non-Heideggerian thought all on the table, and then to recognize that we're faced with a problem here that we're barely equipped to even work through. And that invites us hopefully to go deeper into it. And in doing so, we keep philosophy alive. Philosophy, the life of philosophy depends on there being people who put the question above everything else. Because to philosophize, I think this is accurately stated in Heidegger and other thinkers that I admire. Questioning is the driving force in philosophy. Questioning moves you deeper and deeper into domains that you haven't yet mastered, but as Heidegger puts it, they're concealed and nevertheless compelling. So we haven't mastered them, but they're not trivial. In exposing ourselves to them through questioning, they exert a kind of hold on us. And that, whether you call that being struck by wonder or whether you call it something else, that hold that the realm of the questionable has on us, it's the kind of thing that it doesn't leave you alone somehow. It's always there with you for the rest of your life. And it's the basic element of a philosophical conversion. So I would also put it this way. I mean, I could point to my table and say, my pen is there, my cup is there, my books are there. But Western philosophy, or philosophy as such, thinking as such, it's not just something you can point to and say it's there or it's not there. It's alive when our questioning is alive. It's alive when our thinking is alive. So we don't have to say it's alive only when there's a well-acknowledged tradition that's in place and easily identifiable. Philosophy lives when we expose ourselves to the questions that constitute it, that realm of the concealed and nevertheless compelling. So I would say in that sense, yes, I mean, enough people I have seen with my own eyes and spoke to on my own, directly, who are drawn into understanding what is it to be? What is it to be human? What is it to be a people? What is, these fundamental questions, which they very crucially, they don't just treat as some automatic, it's not just rote. We could go through a bunch of quote unquote philosophical questions and treat them routinely and state them like automatically, like just going through the motions. But there are still people for whom a lot is at stake and they're willing to put themselves at stake. And if you have that, then you have philosophy.
That was very well said. One other response that I often find when those kinds of questions come up is a sort of dismissiveness or almost learned apathy, where they'll say, well, those are eternal questions. Nobody knows the answer. Nobody's going to have the final say on them. And so therefore, those are questions I'm not going to ask about. I'm not going to inquire for myself or for others about the meaning of being human, about the meaning of truth, justice, whatever it may be, because there are more definite questions that I know that I can at least achieve approximate answer to or work or functional answer to. And I'm just curious how you think about that objection.
Yeah, so it's a fair objection, actually. So I would say that there's a obligation that an instructor or somebody who's trying to introduce people to philosophy has a certain obligation. I think every philosopher has faced this obligation and has tried to do it in their own way. And the obligation is exactly what you say, to convey or to communicate or somehow to open a path through philosophy. Dugin said it very beautifully in my interview with him on my YouTube channel, where he said, philosophy is like a castle with no doors. And, how do you enter a castle with no doors? How do you get into this realm? So I'll tell you one of the ways that I see as being the most effective in my experience. One of the most effective ways in my experience is when people get the relevance of something, for example, in Plato, when they see that a question that they have about today's world, or like an observation that they have about today's world, I've seen this a million times. Okay. That's also the thing that attracted me in some sense initially to philosophy. When you see that, or somebody tells you, or you just happen to discover that something that was written 2000 years ago can speak to something that's happening today as though it was written today, not just written today, but written today by a profound observer of the state of affairs and of human nature. And that it's somehow even truer than other things that are said today, that it kind of cuts through so much of the nonsense that's said today and gets to the heart of an issue. In my view, there are many, many points, for example, in Plato that do that. So it could be like, man, where do we even begin? The first page of the Republic tells you that there's a tension between compulsion and persuasion. And if you're like, wow, something that we see in politics all the time today is literally on the first page of like the book on politics in the Western world, maybe there's something else there that's interesting. Or an example that I've given in many conversations, even though maybe it seems trivial, maybe it doesn't, it never does in the conversations that I'm in. It might to people at first, which is why you always have to sort of find what resonates with people. In the Republic, where Socrates is talking about you lend a weapon to your friend, your friend lends a weapon to you, then he wants it back when he's not in his right state of mind. And that, for example, if you give it to him, he's going to go shoot up, he's going to go whatever, right? Commit some sort of heinous crime. And he asks you, do you have it? You do have it, but you lie to him, So it's like, is it always just to tell the truth? Here's a very clear, apparently very clear-cut example where the just thing is to lie. And now everybody today thinks about, is it ever correct to lie? Because they believe their governments are lying to them all the time. And they think that transparency in government communications is the primary virtue, Another thing is that example shows you there's more to justice than property rights. Because after all, the weapon is the other guy's property, right? But you're withholding it from him, and it's just to withhold it from him, so it seems. So it's like, again, that's not 500 pages into the Republic. That's like 2 or 3 pages into it. And suddenly it's raising questions about property rights, about the relationship between justice and truth-telling. One of the videos I did on my channel, I don't know, maybe a year ago now, Jordan Peterson was posting that it's like, you always tell the truth, always tell the truth. You should always tell the truth. And I'm like, okay, well, do we have any great examples of a case where not telling the truth is the right thing to do? Oh yeah, like 2 pages into Plato's Republic. So that's just one example from one book. There are millions of them. The Symposium, Conversations about Love. The beautiful dialogues on beauty, where Socrates argues about what is beauty with a sophist. And it has my favorite wrong answer in all of Plato, where Socrates asks the other character, what is the beautiful? And the other guy's like, so sure he can answer. And he says, the beautiful is a beautiful woman, which is a great answer, but it's wrong. And they walk through all of, maybe the beautiful is the useful, maybe it's the pleasant. So the common theme I've had in all of the people who are like attracted to these authors eventually is that there's something that like anchors where they collapse the distance between the year, whatever year we're in now. What is it? 2023 and 2000 years ago. Because they find a question that just collapses the difference in time. It's like suddenly you're in the exact same conversation. I turned 40 this year, December 31st. So I'm thinking about aging. And there's a conversation, again, in book 1 of the Republic, where Socrates asks the father of the household, Cephalus, like, what's the best thing that you've learned from aging so far? Right. So just example after example after example. It's a little bit later, I would say, that you go from that, the sort of like immediate questions that people can resonate with, gradually into the more apparently obscure dimensions of philosophizing, where you start thinking about the relationship of non-being to being. Like, it's not going to resonate with everybody as quickly if you start talking about being and beings and non-being and beingness. For some people, that's going to be like, no, thank you. I'd rather just go plant something in my garden, which is like hands-on and I can see it grow. But for sure, everybody thinks about love, beauty, justice, war, politics, lying, truth telling, criminality. And maybe that's why like the such a foundational introduction to philosophy, as is Plato's Republic, is embedded in a reflection on the basic contours of political community as well. It's easier. It's an easier starting point for people than launching right into like the inner chambers.
Yeah. And so establishing sort of that personal connection initially, and then from using that sort of wedge to expand out into the deeper questions.
Yeah, I think so because everybody has something. I mean, even somebody who's never thought about philosophy or never read a philosopher, couldn't name a philosopher. I think that everybody has entertained quote unquote philosophical questions in a genuine way for themselves about life and death, about meaning, about the contrast between love of family and love of country. Like we all have those questions, but a person needs to be shown, I think, that they have been articulated thoughtfully and intelligently by people we call philosophers in a way that can be helpful.
Yeah. And when you brought up closing the gap between the present and the past, one of the things that I always have to like, so philosophy is a lot of philosophy is remembering, remembering what you've forgotten. And one of the things that I always remember every time I go back to philosophy, I don't get to study it as much as I would like these days, is that there's always a moment where I'm reading a text and it feels like I'm communing with an old friend. And then I remember, oh yes, these texts are my old friends from the past. They are dead philosophers. And they are speaking to me in a way that, the very best of friends that I could have now, if they were here in this room, that I would like to engage with them. And that's just one of the little intimate joys, I'd say, of reading philosophy that's outside of any, objective criteria for material gain or otherwise. It really is a kind of activity that is worth it for its own sake, and so therefore of the highest order.
Absolutely. It's I think it's true when you are trying to introduce people again in a new way, right? And if people want to know what's in it for me, how's it useful, or right, what am I going to get out of it? One of the things I really learned from Strauss was that there's a quote unquote hedonistic defense of philosophy, that philosophy offers you a great pleasure. So it's like some people seek pleasure, and if they can be convinced that philosophy is a source of pleasure, that'll attract them to it. But one of the things that's unique about philosophy is that it's like you don't it's accompanied by these incredible pleasures. That's true. Pleasure is not the criterion that gets people into it, but then they discover that it has these specific charms, and that charm of communing with friends over thousands of years who feel like they can be closer to you than some people who are very close to you, because there is something intimate about philosophy in that way, and the pleasures are real and the charms are substantive. It's hard to convince people of that, I think, at the outset. It's something you have to kind of experience as you go into it. So one of the things about philosophy that doesn't, how could you put it, generalize, like you can't easily pitch it to everybody, is because it does withhold some of its greatest pleasures for the people who are like willing to meet it halfway, or willing to go where it is. Some things they'll go like exactly all the way where you are, and they'll just like drop the benefits in your lap or whatever. Mm-hmm. Philosophy, people do have to make an effort, to get into it, to understand it, to move towards it. But by all accounts, it's worth it. It's worth it, not just for the way that it can have a practical benefit, but for these other sort of like harder to communicate, but much more genuine benefits, which are amazing. I mean, the experience, it's funny sometimes. For some people, like 500 years ago is a long time, which in some way it is, right? If it's like, wow, this thing's 500 years old. Mm-hmm. Like if you found a coin in your backyard that was 500 years old, that would probably be awesome. Some people find a coin that's like 50 years old, and that's awesome. So you read Plato's long time ago, long time ago. And it's amazing. And then if you discuss it with people, that is so enriching as well. I mean, here's another book of Plato's, The Laws, a truly amazing work. Okay. The first line of this book The Athenian stranger is asking, the guy from Athens is asking two other old Greeks, a Cretan and a Spartan, who do you say gave you your laws, a god or a man? Like the very first question of the book, do laws come from God or from man? What's the role of the divine in legislation? And how do we think about divinely revealed codes of law? And if God was a lawgiver, what would he try to aim at? Like all the virtues or some of the virtues, and they talk about war and civil war and foreign war. And it's like, if you're a thinking human being who cares about the human condition, this is like, I would rather find this than dig up 20 gold bars in my backyard or like a 500-year-old coin. This is the coin right here. It's like, it's a treasure, but people, again, it's not like a bar of gold. You sort of know, that you have it, or like a diamond, you sort of know, like you can, or you scratch a lottery ticket and but if you have a book of Plato in front of you, you may not know that you're sitting in front of a treasure, and the job of somebody who's introducing to people to philosophy is to like give that, gradually let them see that it's a book of treasure. And the easiest way that I know of is to connect it to something that they care about and show that it's a articulation of it that is profound.
So one of the transitioning a little bit away from, our indulgence in the beauty of philosophy and the joy of studying philosophy. One of the things that sort of concerned me and is kind of the impetus for the Hacking State project, but was sort of, developing many years prior to Hacking State, even when I was doing my previous show, this is something that was on my mind, is the philosophy of technology. Now, I'm not a Heideggerian. I'm not a Heideggerian scholar, but I did get introduced to Heidegger initially through his essay on the question concerning technology, which I've covered myself, which was actually another recall to Justin Murphy. It was actually sent to me originally by him via email. He sent me an email out of the blue one day and said, "Hey, I think you're interested in philosophy of technology. Here's this Heidegger essay you might want to read." And I actually sat on it for a while and did not read it. And then eventually found it again and was like, okay, I should probably read this. And what I wanted to say was that, first of all, if you're trying to get a handle on philosophy of technology, that's a great place to start, because Heidegger himself has a very piercing way of considering these problems. And he's writing this in, I believe, the 1950s, and he's trying to assess the nature of technology. And one of the things that I'm sure comes up a lot, especially because you're working with a lot of people in tech or adjacent to tech, is concerns about technology itself, what it's doing to us, whether or not it is changing the human condition in a fundamental way, or enabling us to be better or worse versions of ourselves. These are all questions that people, I think, are really beginning to take seriously. And I just find myself continually going back to that Heidegger essay, and wishing that I understood it better, and also wishing maybe that it had been a little bit longer, because the answer Heidegger gives us, which we're not going to go through the whole argument right now, it's quite complicated, is somewhat unsatisfactory, but it does point towards a way of rediscovering our own humanity, sort of as the light at the end of the tunnel. And I jumped into this digression, not to ask you about the question concerning technology, but to ask you about Heidegger as your opening to Dugin, as you mentioned previously, or really Dugin's presentation of Heidegger, which then got you back into Dugin. What is it about Heidegger? Dugin said in your interview that he's sort of the prince of philosophy. Plato is the king. Heidegger would be the prince. Why is Heidegger the prince of philosophy? And are you thinking of philosophy in these episodic terms, or are you more partial to Strauss's view that it's sort of just an ongoing pedagogy?
For me, it is. It's an open question, and it's one that I wrote about in my dissertation at the University of Toronto, which was published as a book called Beginning with Heidegger. Mm-hmm. And in the book Beginning with Heidegger, I do contrast, for example, Strauss and Dugin, not only those two, but let's say those two in particular for the purpose of our conversation. to try to see how to make sense and how to make sense of and how to work through the dispute over the nature of philosophy. Is it historical in the way that Heidegger sees it, or is it eternal, let's say, in the way that Strauss sees it? The debate over the significance of history for philosophy is at the heart of a lot of disputes, not only the one that we can construct between Strauss and Heidegger, but also, for example, the one that Strauss had with Kojève in his debate with Kojève and On Tyranny. Mm-hmm. So I try to articulate as best I can and understand for myself as best I can what's at stake in the dispute and who got the kind of, like, for example, I don't think that Strauss in his presentations of Heidegger is quite as, how could you put this? Even though Strauss for me is an absolute authority in the interpretation of the history of political philosophy, I have reasons to doubt that his interpretation of Heidegger is adequate. So that's something I write about in my beginning with Heidegger book. Heidegger, I mean, we have many different starting points, but I'll tell you what my starting points are. Number one, Heidegger is an authority for Strauss. I mean, Strauss said Heidegger is the greatest thinker of our time. So it's absolutely recognized as the thinker for us, you know, like the profoundest interpreter prior maybe to Strauss himself of the possibility of a return to Greek philosophy, the idea that we never really did understand Plato and Aristotle because we never had an adequate interpretation of them because too much was presupposed. I mean, Strauss credits Heidegger with opening the door to a return to Plato and Aristotle. He says it in several different essays. Heidegger showed the possibility of a genuine philosophical return to Plato and Aristotle. He showed that they had never been mastered. So we start with the fact that Heidegger is authoritative for Strauss, but he's authoritative for several other philosophers who think in a completely different direction than Strauss. He's authoritative for Derrida. He's authoritative for Rorty. He's authoritative for Dugin. Those are the four people I cover in my book. Mm-hmm. So how is it that one figure stands at the center and at the heart? Everybody looks to him and acknowledges that he's accomplished something uniquely profound. And yet each of them has an incompatible interpretation of the significance of his work, both philosophically and politically. That's my starting puzzle in some sense. And in case it's interesting, the moment that this became configured in my mind as a puzzle was when I was translating Dugin's first book on Heidegger at the same time as a master's student at the University of Toronto at the time. And I was taking a course as well on political theology, basically leftist political theology. So like I was in a class roughly of leftist thinkers influenced by Heidegger at the same time as I was translating Dugin's book on Heidegger. And so at one and the same moment, I saw the deep similarities and dissimilarities in these two reception histories. Mm. Dugin was putting an emphasis on what he called Heidegger's middle period writings, including this one right here, Contributions to Philosophy of the Event. He said the key to Heidegger is those middle period writings. The key to Heidegger is the notion of another beginning of philosophy. That's why Dugin's first Heidegger book is called Martin Heidegger, The Philosophy of Another Beginning. He puts the idea of another beginning front and center. The French Heideggerians, they didn't have it on their radar at all. So that's why I say they stopped at the end of metaphysics. They like the idea of an end because what happens at the end? Somehow everything falls apart. Yeah. And you can use the metaphysics. I mean, you can use sort of the philosophy of the end of metaphysics, socially, politically, morally, artistically, but it's a pulling apart. It's a dissipation. Whereas the idea of another beginning, sheltering, gathering, grounding, for them, that's how fascists talk. Fascists talk about grounding and sheltering and preserving. And that's like, so they're anti-fascist.
And rebuilding.
Exactly. Yeah. So for the French Heideggerians, it's like the philosophy of another beginning is Heidegger's Nazification of philosophy, which we don't like. But his idea of an end of metaphysics, that's like a liberalization of philosophy, which we love, because then we can pull apart absolutes and stuff like that. So when I saw those two things together, I realized there was a puzzle here. And then you add in the fact that, as I mentioned, Heidegger was such an authority. Authority is the wrong word. Heidegger was recognized as a great by Strauss. So that allowed me to just build a field of problems. I can't say, so your friends who are looking for solutions as opposed to problems, they won't like this. but I wanted the statement of the puzzle, you know? How is this one philosopher at the heart of all of these disputes? And they all take them in different directions. The easy answer is like, it's all arbitrary. But that, you know, rejecting the easy answer, it's like, no, quite a bit is at stake. And there's a lot of interplay between people's moral and political opinions and their willingness to have philosophy lead the way. Because it's like, if philosophy takes you into an anti-democratic direction, do you go there or do you force it into another direction? That kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting facets at the heart of this disagreement is that if you find yourself in search of a solution because you are too impatient to ask questions, then you are presuming to know where you are already. And one of the distinctions I would say between, you know, the philosophically inclined and the not so philosophically inclined is that the philosophically inclined are not making the assumption that we necessarily know where we are. And sort of the entire theme of our discussion about Strauss and about Heidegger and Dugin as well has as an underlying current that the history of Western philosophy is not solved. It's not fully understood. And we may, in fact, not even know where we are yet.
Yeah, I think that is important. The idea of place in relationship to where we are, like, you know, in relationship to thinking and its location. I'll give you a great example. Plato's cave. So in Plato's cave, where are we? Well, you could be at the bottom of the cave looking at shadows. You could be on the way up the cave, but not quite out of it. You could be out of it, but not quite adjusted, you know, to everything that you see out of it. You could be on your way back down. You know, maybe you went up to the fire and then you ran back down to the shadows, which Plato describes as part of the cave allegory. So it's like, even if you take the simple figure of the cave allegory and we ask, where are we at any part of that process? There are several different possible answers: on our way up, on our way down. Maybe we don't even know that we're in a cave. And then we add to that Strauss's very nice elaboration where he says, in fact, Western man today is in a cave beneath the cave. So where are we? We are beneath Plato's cave. And we need to make an effort just to get back up to the state of natural ignorance, which is the proper starting point for a genuine philosophical ascent. So he says modern man, technological society has tried to solve the problem of the ignorance of the cave by digging down. So where are we? We're in a hole. We're in a hole that we've dug that's even deeper than the one that we're in by nature, you know, according to the ignorance that's just inborn with us or in us. So I think that's very helpful. In fact, I would say it's surprising that topography, like the idea of place and configuration of places, should be so essentially bound to philosophical thinking. And yet it seems to be, you know, like, again, if we take Plato's cave allegory as sort of the most profound and penetrating image of philosophical education that we have access to, it's the fact that it's spatial is crucial. Up, down, in, out, all of those dimensions are there. So yeah, I think you're right. And there's quite a lot, I think, to the observation that a philosopher does have to try to figure out not just who am I, but where am I in my thinking? What do I stand on? And incidentally, one of the things I think Heidegger helps us to see is all of the sort of grounds that we take for granted. Like I say, it doesn't make any sense that someone might say it doesn't make any sense to ask where I am. I know where I am. I am, and then they'll fill in the blank. Like, you know, they'll fill in the blank. I am in the year, so they'll like their reference point will be temporal, or it'll be evolutionary, or it'll be bodily, or it'll be this, or it'll be that. You know, it's like all of the possible places where you can stand. And the beautiful thing about philosophy is you begin to try to see more. You know, you don't just take for granted the first answer that comes to mind.
So I asked you about Heidegger because of Dugin's presentation of Heidegger and sort of the configuration that clicked in your brain when you were studying Heidegger's in the two realms, in the classroom and on your own doing translations of Dugin's work. I won't ask you to recount the entire storied history of yourself and the trouble that you got into for studying Dugin and for translating Dugin. That's out there. we've briefly touched on it. I'm sure that you have other content related to it out there in many other interviews. But what initially drew you in to Dugin? Why did you decide to take up this extremely controversial and now in some ways even more controversial since the start of the war philosophers?
Yeah, so my first exposure to him was an article about him. And the article resonated because it said, I mean, it began with an anecdote, and it began with like a story, and the story was that Dugin had been expelled from Ukraine for an anti-Ukrainian position, like he'd been expelled from the country. And in response, the Kremlin expelled the Ukrainian ambassador, something like that. Okay. So this was like how that article opened. This was my first exposure to Dugin. And he was, in the start of that article, he was called like a Russian philosopher or something. And what was weird to me was that you would expel an ambassador in response for the expulsion of a philosopher.
Right.
Like that's weird, like
seems out of proportion.
It seems out of proportion. So the idea that he was somehow important enough of a philosopher that you would exchange like an ambassador for him in a tit for tat of expulsions was kind of intriguing to me. And then at the time, I have mentioned this in other interviews, I'll say it here as well. At the time, I had an interest in mysticism. And he was described in this article as somebody who had a background in like mystic circles or esoteric circles or occult circles. And so the first one was like philosopher king figure. Okay. Like somehow the Kremlin has the back of this philosopher who's somehow so influential. That was intriguing. Then the mysticism, that was intriguing. And then at the time, I was also actually learning and intending to learn Russian in order to understand the history of Russian philosophy. There was another guy that I was more interested in, Vladimir Solovyov. There's a character in Brothers Karamazov who's patterned after him, Alyosha. But this article was like also saying that if you want to understand Russia today, you really need to understand Dugin. So there were three things. There was like my interest in Russia, check. My interest in mysticism, check. And my interest in the figure of a philosopher king, check. So that article, it did its job. It piqued my interest and it made me look for more. And then the first thing that I found when I was looking for more was a presentation that he gave. It was a 5-minute video. Okay. 5-minute video on the idea of the fourth political theory. And I listened to that video. I don't know whether I need to say the basic idea. If anybody's familiar with Dugin, they will have heard it before. If they're familiar with me, they will have heard it before.
Well, please just give us a brief summary and then maybe
here's the nutshell is very simple. The 20th century was a war of ideologies, liberalism, communism, and fascism. So he called those the first, second, and third political theory. Liberalism and its variants, communism and its variants, fascism and its variants. And, fascism was defeated. Then you had the bipolar Cold War world between liberalism and communism. Communism was defeated. Liberalism was the last ideology standing. But what do you do if you want to oppose liberalism, neither on the basis of the second political theory, communism, nor on the basis of the third political theory, fascism/Nazism? So he says, it's like all thought seems to have been exhausted by the view that the three political theories are all there is: liberalism, communism, fascism. And he says, if you want to reject liberalism, not on the basis of those other theories, we're going to begin by just stating fourth political theory as like expanding the scope of what could be thought, okay, beyond those three theories. So it sounds trivial, but I'll tell you why it resonated with me. I mean, maybe it doesn't sound trivial. Maybe people are like, what about anarchism? What about this? What about that? But I'll tell you what resonated with me. I was an undergraduate student, and this was like an instant. We said how you can collapse the distance between us and Plato when one thing hits and resonates, right? So something that Dugin said immediately resonated with me, which was this. A lot of things, including my interest in Strauss, were being called fascist. I was at the University of British Columbia. Okay, I had professors tell me Strauss is a fascist. I also have an interest in it's the project of Israeli statehood. Okay, so Zionism. And I was like, that's fascist. And when I heard Dugin's model, the light bulb that went off was this. Oh yeah, who gets called a fascist? If you're not a liberal and you're not a communist, they call you a fascist. Because that's all they know. That's all they know. And I was like, wow, that checks out. That just checks out. I mean, that's true. If you're not a liberal and you're not a communist, you're assumed to be fascist. But Strauss, for example, not a liberal in the full-blown sense, definitely not a communist, and clearly not a fascist, despite some things that he wrote in his youth about fascism. Okay. Or again, in my view, the state of Israel, not fully liberal. Okay. It has liberal elements, not fully communist, although it has socialist elements. Clearly not fascist either, in my view, although, you know, the founders of the Supreme Court there studied Schmidt. So the point was, it's like, yeah, I think a lot of people, I said to myself, are using the three political theory models when they see the world. It's just that light bulb went off. 5-minute speech. So I searched them up.
There's a category error, right? Which is
there's
no other bucket to put you in.
100%, no other bucket. So I was like, how can everybody? It's not possible that, you know, Strauss is a fascist and everybody's a fascist. Like, come on. Clearly somewhere they've made a mistake. And it was like such a simple and clear cut presentation. And I said, yeah, that's for sure. People are making that mistake. So I looked them up. I went to his Russian Wikipedia page at the time. This was 2011, his Russian Wikipedia page. And I saw that he had a book called The Fourth Political Theory. So I had the article, then I had this 5-minute speech, and then I saw he had a book called The Fourth Political Theory. As I say, I was an undergraduate at the time, and I was learning Russian for philosophical purposes. So I proposed a translation project. I said, I want to learn a technical philosophical vocabulary in Russian. Here's a contemporary Russian philosopher that I just read about who interests me. I heard his speech on the fourth political theory. I see he's got a book on the fourth political theory. Why don't I just translate that? And my supervisor at the time said, go for it. And so I started translating the fourth political theory. And the amazing thing was, every time I would submit part of the translation to the supervisor, and you got to keep in mind, this was like at the exact time as Putin was announcing a Eurasian Union. And I'm translating Dugin's fourth political theory. And it was like a revelation. You know, I was bringing something into English that was hugely topical and interesting. And so my supervisor said to me at some point in the process, have you ever thought about reaching out to Dugin to get this published? Which had never crossed my mind in a million years until he suggested it. Then I'm like, no, I haven't. So you should. So I did. And we did. I reached out to him, and long story, you know, the book got published. Yeah. Somebody else in Russia was translating at the same time. So our translation was put together and released. And then I just continued, because everything of his that I was reading and translating, whether I agreed with every sentence of it or not is a different issue, but it always had something thought-provoking to offer that helped me to make a better sense of the state of affairs internationally, globally. And that gave me something to think about philosophically, other than what, to my mind, was the overzealously liberal mood of philosophizing in the universities, which again, were either liberal or critical of liberalism from the left. And I'm like, okay, this is a research project, you know? I have an intelligent, anti-liberal thinker on the right who is a key to understanding Russia at a time when Russia is becoming more important in the world. And he's referring in many cases to the same sources as my other leading light, Strauss, was. Both of them take Heidegger seriously. Both of them take Plato seriously. Both of them take Schmidt seriously, you know? And so it was like, okay, here we go. And that was fascinating for me. It continues to be fascinating for me. And that's just how I pursued it. I mean, that's sort of how it put itself together.
Do you think that Alexander Dugin is a dangerous philosopher?
Well, yes. But again, it's one of those things where we have to see what makes a philosopher dangerous. You know, Socrates was a dangerous philosopher. What's our evidence? He was accused of corrupting the youth, not believing in the gods of the city and all of that. And he was killed. He wasn't killed for being not dangerous. You know, he was killed because he, among other reasons, seemed to have pulled the rug out under the feet of people who were potentially tyrannical or, you know, shaking their faith in what the city believed that they should worship without further ado, you know? So somehow, like, there's something inherently dangerous about philosophy properly done, which is why Costa and Alamario's book, Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, reminds us of the kinship between philosophy and tyranny. So that's like, at one level, the essence of philosophy is somehow dangerous, you know, with all of the qualifiers. It's not like it's as dangerous as a, you know, armed psycho on the street or something like that, but it's dangerous in a certain way. Mm-hmm. But Dugin is dangerous to the Western liberal consensus, if there is one, in another way, which is that he's like an avowed enemy of Western political modernity. And he's somebody who's trying to win followers in the fight against Western political modernity. And he's somebody who inspires concretely, political movements that are dedicated in their own way to the destruction of Western political modernity. And in that sense, he's much more conspicuously dangerous than somebody like Socrates, who never tried to fight an ideological war at a global scale using mass propaganda. You know what I'm saying? So there's a difference in the way that philosophers can be dangerous. He's one who's dangerous in the sense that he, as I say, has his sights aimed and trained on Western hegemonic political modernity as he sees it, and is willing to use all of his intellectual resources, at the very least, to deal it a death blow. So I can see why, for example, the professors of mine who didn't like him would regard him as an enemy politically. That's fine. That makes sense. He would also regard them as enemies politically. I would only go the extra step and say we can still learn from our enemies. And I don't think that philosophy maps in the same way in terms of friends and enemies as politics does necessarily. You can feel that kinship that you feel, as you say, with philosophers of old. I think even when they write from within an enemy country, or they write, you know what I'm saying? Like there's something about, there's a sort of kinship that transcends. I mean, Derrida has a book called Politics of Friendship. In my view, the peak of the politics of friendship is the meeting of the minds between the philosophers, even if they happen to belong to enemy civilizations or enemy countries or enemy blocks or enemy armies. It's that recognition across political communities that there's something valuable and something thought-provoking at stake. But yeah, if we take the philosophy out of the picture, he's an enemy propagandist to the Western world. And in that sense, you can almost understand why he's censored and banned and put on sanctions lists, and sometimes a direct target of political violence. Like people may know that his daughter was assassinated in what was reportedly an attempt on his life. So all of that makes sense in the logic of basic political enmity. But he's still somebody that I think we can learn from and that we should learn from.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting fact about it is that he's someone that is naturally appealing, or at least curious, to people that are in the West, that are not enemies of the West, but are disgruntled with the current status quo of the, let's say, political economy or the regime machinations that are underway. There's a sense in which, for lack of a better term, dissidents in the West, even though we're not anything near as destitute as Soviet dissidents might have been, or dissidents in other regimes, we're relatively safe, are going to seek out anyone that has a strong and forceful intellectual critique of the current system, even though they may be patriotic in their actual sentiments.
Yeah, that is indisputable. And it does require that people navigate this operation delicately. How do you learn from somebody whose criticisms are at times not just intriguing, but let's say on the money, seemingly putting into words what everybody can sense and feel who's looking at the situation with some dissatisfaction, and reconcile that with the fact that at another level, you can't go along with him all the way on every question and every issue. So it requires a little bit of subtlety to entertain and to value correctly, to estimate correctly a criticism of one's time and place, and not necessarily to buy fully into, an American patriot can learn from Dugin's criticism of American global liberalism for sure. And there are many who have. And there are many who have discussed it. We mentioned earlier, I was on Orrin McIntyre's program discussing Dugin's fourth political theory, and countless examples of, I think, well-meaning Americans who don't like the current regime, learning from people like Dugin about how to articulate its limitations, but who wouldn't want America to become Russia, and who don't want to throw off all that's good about America, and who wouldn't buy into all of the other elements of the criticism if there is one like that. So that requires, as I say, some, you have to be able to do the delicate operation of accepting a criticism as far as it goes and not necessarily farther. But one of the great things is that, Dugin is a thoughtful, erudite analyst of political affairs, internationally and domestically. I think that he's really helped people to formulate in a theoretical way some of what they're dissatisfied by in their domestic politics. For example, the book Great Awakening versus Great Reset. It's a nice, short, tract-like manifesto that puts its finger on a lot of the movements and a lot of the phenomena that people, well-meaning American patriot types, would reject as, the machinations of a globalist elite. It's like analysis that is spot on in many cases. So that's true. But you can also say people like Carl Schmitt. In other words, it's not a problem that's unique to Dugin, right? Carl Schmitt has an analysis of the crisis of Weimar Constitution. Profound, useful analysis. I teach his book, Legality and Legitimacy in the School. Does it mean that if we accept his criticisms, we have to go all in on Schmitt's unique political history and every other solution that he would have provided and everything he said about anything ever? No. My view is, like, I once wrote a paper which summarized in some sense, even in the title, an intellectual task that I think is important and will become more important and that people should take seriously. Not that they don't, but that they should continue to do more and more, which is this. I call it the virtues of right-wing anti-liberalism. Right-wing anti-liberalism, meaning we're not talking about socialist, communist critiques of liberalism. We're not talking about the critique of capitalist inequality on the basis of social justice, egalitarianism. Right-wing anti-liberalism. Why the virtues? Because roughly people know the vices. Somehow automatically people are aware of the vices of right-wing anti-liberalism. The idea of like genocidal chauvinism and somehow like a narrow, brutal interpretation of the world that just is, what I'm saying?
Yeah, social Darwinism.
The vices of right-wing, roughly I think people have a picture of the vices of right-wing anti-liberalism. Mm-hmm. But they don't have an adequate account of the virtues, of the several virtues, possibly of the incompatible virtues. And even that formulation, the virtues of right-wing anti-liberalism, it forces us to think through. Yeah, exactly. Because we're so used to only saying bad things about right-wing anti-liberals that we have to put that whole field. I mean, this formed for me pretty early on in my graduate studies, this particular thesis. We have to put the whole field of right-wing anti-liberalism back onto the spectrum, back onto the radar, in order with some degree of accuracy and precision and nuance to sort of map that territory out. Schmitt is not equivalent to Dugin, is not equivalent to Strauss, is not equivalent to Vandenbroek, is not equivalent to de Maistre. And yet they all live in this part of the spectrum, not on the other part of the spectrum. So it's like mapping that out is very important. And then seeing what can we take that's good and what should we omit that's bad. It's like very elementary, but to even go there has been so difficult. It's been difficult because it's been rendered off limits. If you show an interest in right-wing anti-liberalism, you're called a Nazi and a fascist only to discredit you, not to describe you. And the discrediting makes it less and less likely that you'll ever have an adequate grasp of what is presented there. And by the way, Plato sometimes gets slotted into that picture.
I was just going to say, there's like basically no chance that Plato would even be published today.
Exactly.
Karl Popper and so forth, like he would just be immediately, this is unacceptable.
For sure. I heard anecdotally, again, I don't know how widespread this is. Maybe people who are listening will have a better idea, especially if you have listeners in academia. But I remember hearing when I was at the University of Toronto, or slightly maybe sometime after I left, that there was some student who, let's put it this way, there was a deep suspicion. I heard about a deep suspicion towards a student just because they showed a genuine interest in Plato's Laws, and Plato's Laws is not a liberal book. I mean, it's true. Plato's Laws is not a liberal book. But for a student who expresses interest in Plato's Laws to be like brushed, with the brush of suspicion, and that is just too much. That's beyond the pale. So that just shows you that on one hand, you have this field, as I say, the virtues of right-wing anti-liberalism, that maybe has something to offer, at the very least, analytically. Like, I believe that my work on Dugin has proven to be a contribution in understanding Russia's war with the West in the 10 years since I started it. I mean, I have evidence for that. I have people who are not just nobodies, but people who are somebodies in the analysis of world affairs reaching out to me and asking me to brief them on Dugin, you know? So it's like, very obviously, it has been a helpful lens in which to understand, if not to predict, for sure to understand something about Russia's position vis-a-vis the West. But now imagine that it had been, I mean, my research on Dugin, yeah, I faced some challenges at the university, but still, it could have been much, much worse. Imagine I had never been allowed to, to translate or to publish or to release or to do anything. There would be such a blind spot. Now, I'm not saying I did something incredible. No, I did something pretty like modest, but it still illuminated a relevant part of contemporary politics. So now imagine the rest of the unilluminated realm of right-wing anti-liberalism that's unilluminated because people are not allowed to go there. And again, I include Plato in that. And how much of the world now can people not see because they've been deliberately blinded in being forbidden to consult the sources that they could learn from? It's like
it's the cave beneath the cave all over again.
It's the cave beneath the cave, 100%. 100%. You know, so we have a task of reversing that descent, not just digging a hole, gradually being able to see more. And another thing I would say, you know, we started off this conversation where I was telling people about video, right? How going into video could be helpful. Another thing I want to add here, if anybody knows a second language, translation is something I would recommend. There are books in your language if you speak a second language, or, you know, if your first language is not English. There are untranslated books that would be a contribution to English speaking readers if only they were aware of them. They can't be made aware of them unless somebody translates them and then shows their significance. So I recommend, if anybody wants to take me up on this, if you speak a second language and there's some author you resonate with who's not translated, translate it. Okay. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, the Dugin thing has been huge for me personally, and I think for the field that I was addressing. And it would not, you know, not that I was the only person translating, but like the translators are the ones who made possible an acquaintance with Dugin's thought. Also, he does interviews in English, but you know what I mean? The familiarity with his books is only because people were translating them. So that's my other recommendation besides videos. If you do a second language, translate something.
Yeah. And I'll just say that me and some other people are in some interesting discussions about a technological solution to this translation problem, getting more of the world's text translated into English, at least to start. But maybe you'll hear more on that in the future. It's very early stages right now. I wanted to, just because I would be remiss in the time that we have left to not mention it, given that you brought it up, briefly ask you about Kostin Alamaru and his book, Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, which you did a review on. You did a nice, succinct 30-minute review that did very well. And I did a review as well in partnership with Stephen Pimentel, who writes for Palladium. Actually, admittedly, I haven't watched your review yet, but I've seen the numbers on it and they're quite good. You know, you brought him up because you mentioned briefly the sort of tension that exists between the potential for tyranny and philosophy. And again, this entire discussion has sort of been about not only the value of philosophy, but also the danger of philosophy, or the perceived danger of philosophy to various regimes, to society, or even to people's own sense of their own certainty about the world. And so, given that I haven't seen your review yet, I wanted to just take the opportunity to ask you, what did you think about the core thesis of the book, that philosophy and tyranny are in some ways twins arising out of the same seed, which is the awareness of nature and its distinction from convention?
Yeah, I think that it is I think it's a solid thesis in that sense. Both the philosopher and the tyrant are concerned with the preservation of something that, under the domination of convention, is destroyed, or, you know, the genuine nature, the the potential philosopher is how Strauss sees it. And the person who could become a potential philosopher is the same as the person who could become a potential tyrant in some sense, because they both have that extra something, that extra vitality or that extra passionarity or that extra desire, that extra nature. I mean, one of the things I learned from Costin's book is to think about nature as as a certain vitality. To say that a person has more nature, I don't think I would have used that formulation before, but I was pretty convinced in his Pindar chapter that that is like a usage, an aristocratic usage before the philosophical conceptualization of it. You know, that what we say is like having more vitality could be stated as having more nature, or as, you know, when I did my restatement of it, I thought of it in terms of, again, the cave allegory as a person having more being. You know, just like the ideas are the more beingful beings, there are people who are more beingful people. They're the ones who are more, they are more truly, they exist more actually, you know, they just really are somehow in a more intense way or in a more intense sense. So he showed those usages in Pindar, which I thought were pretty interesting. And then the idea that both the philosopher and the tyrant are concerned with that. I mean, there's more to the thesis. There's also that philosophy needs tyranny. So it's not just that the philosopher and the tyrant both have an interest in a nature that would otherwise be destroyed by convention, or that would be, if not destroyed, then, you know,
suffocated or
smothered, yeah, suffocated.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's also that if for philosophy to accomplish what it wants to accomplish, it has to exercise a tyrannical political rule. And if it doesn't, then it lets itself be smothered by some other kind of tyranny, the tyranny of convention or the tyranny of the mediocre. I think there's something to that as well. For sure there is in Plato, for sure there is in Nietzsche, and it's appropriate to remind people about that. I would say two other things. In my mind, the aim of his book, there's a lot to say about it, okay? It's a dense and
it's a complicated argument.
Exactly. But to say two things, the aim of his book, in my view, is similar to the aim of other books that want to remind people of what philosophy is. It's like a defense of philosophy at a time where philosophy maybe has become toothless. You know, so
yes.
Heidegger wants to remind people about what philosophy is at a time where language has lost its essential saying power. Strauss wants to remind people of what philosophy is at a time that philosophy has become equivalent to the sciences, or somehow it's lost its unique privileged place of importance, you know, the philosophical supremacy. So I would say that he also is trying to revitalize and remind people of what philosophy essentially is. So some people asked me in my video, like, or they commented like he has something to do with his book is not primarily about teaching people when to have children or when not to have children. You know, it's not like
they get caught up in the title. They get really caught up.
They do. That's obviously effectively designed to trip people up in that way. But the key thing is to remind people about the genuine nature of philosophy, in my view. And, you know, in order to do that, he has to restate the thesis of its kinship with tyranny. So that's there. And then the other thing I would say, as I think about his thesis, as I think about his claims, and in particular, the importance of biology and the body, which is something that he shares not only with Pindar at the beginning, but with Nietzsche at the end. Just like I felt when reading Bronze Age Mindset, on the basis of the sources that I know and the arguments that I entertain and consider important, I still see the Heideggerian alternative to this Nietzschean presentation. I mean, Nietzschean / Platonic, even if you like, because he does bring Nietzsche and Plato together in those chapters. But I still see the Heideggerian alternative, because for Heidegger, the key question is somehow not nature in the same way as it is for Pindar, Plato, Nietzsche. And it's not the body or the bodily vitality as it is for, you know, Pindar, Nietzsche. And yet, clearly, we have to entertain it as a work of philosophy, but one that's primarily oriented towards a specific interpretation of being that is meant to be distinct from the Platonic and Nietzschean version. So whenever as I was reading Selective Breeding and learning about the relationship of philosophy and tyranny as he presented it there, in particular, like I said, I didn't really know the Pindar elements before, and there are other parts of his argument that were new to me. I still think the staging of a confrontation between Kostin's Nietzschean view of philosophy, and he himself says that Nietzsche is going to be the most important philosopher of the future, and the Heideggerian alternative. In my view, that's like a philosophical project that is well worth undertaking, and that I think is going to be part of the future of the right-wing dissidents. You know, the thoughtful right-wing dissidents who are attracted to Bronze Age pervert, who are attracted to Kostin, who are attracted to Nietzschean thinking, at some point, they will need, in my view, to stage the philosophical encounter between Nietzsche and Heidegger in a way that sort of doesn't just take for granted that Nietzsche is the superior alternative of the two. So that's the only other thing I'll say. I liked it. I thought it was good, well written, rousing, entertaining, instructive, and in many senses true. And I would recommend that people read it.
Well, you left us with a very juicy puzzle to consider. I'll have to think about that for a long time. Well, Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show once again. And I believe we've done a great job of just giving people a tour of things related to philosophy, the school, your interest in Dugin, Heidegger, especially. Before I let you go, what is coming next from the school, and what can people expect to see from you in the future?
So the school is moving towards a membership model. And the idea is that instead of selling individual courses to students who just watch the courses on their own, which is what some people had been doing in the school, I now will be offering all access membership to all the courses. And the membership is going to include several private sessions with me. And it's going to allow me to do more sort of workshops and seminars and events, hopefully culminating in in-person events at some point, which is aspirational for me since everything is online right now. More towards building a community of thinkers who want the comprehensive inquiry as opposed to just a particular course, and allowing me again to offer more of my time one-on-one and in small group seminars. So that's something the school is moving towards gradually as we end this year. And then I'll also say, if anybody has been sort of intrigued but isn't like all in on Strauss, Heidegger, and all of that, but is like the interest in philosophy has been piqued, I have a online introduction to philosophy at philosophyintro.com. And it's like 4 lessons delivered by email that starts with what we discussed earlier, like connecting to what people's pre-existing philosophical questions are, even if they wouldn't call them philosophical questions. So I encourage people to go to philosophyintro.com if that's something that they would like. But yeah, the direction of the school, Millerman School 2.0, or the next iteration, is this membership model. I'm very excited by. I have some new members this month, and it's great. Talking to intelligent people about the way these books relate to one another and to our lives and to our situation is just extremely satisfying. I'm getting great feedback, and knock on wood, it's going to keep going like this.
Well, that's great to hear. All right. The incomparable Michael Millerman, everybody. Thank you.